A man was strolling through a camp one warm afternoon when a sight stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't the peaceful vibe of the camp or the size of the animals. It was the elephants themselves. These majestic creatures, towering and strong, were bound by the simplest, most feeble restraint he had ever seen. On one of their enormous legs hung a small, thin piece of rope, tethered casually to a peg in the ground. There were no cages, no heavy chains, no imposing barriers, just that little rope. And yet, the elephants stood still, calm and motionless. The man scratched his head, puzzled. With their strength, these elephants could snap those ropes like twigs, uproot the pegs, and vanish into the wild within seconds. But they didn't. Not one of them seemed to try. They stood there as though the ropes were unbreakable bonds. Overwhelmed by curiosity, he approached a trainer nearby. "Excuse me," he said, pointing to one of the elephants. "Why on earth don't these animals try to escape with their power? That little rope can't possibly hold them." The trainer smiled knowingly, as if he'd answered this question hundreds of times before. "Well," he said, wiping his hands, "when these elephants were much younger and much smaller, we used the same kind of rope to tie them. Back then, it was enough to hold them in place." The man tilted his head, still not understanding. "You see," the trainer continued, "when they were little, they'd pull and tug, trying to break free. Over time, they learned they couldn't. No matter how hard they tried, the rope was stronger than they were. So eventually, they stopped trying altogether." The trainer looked at the elephants with a mix of pride and sadness. And now, even as fully grown adults, they don't question it anymore. They believe that same tiny rope can still hold them. To them, it's not a rope. It's a wall. The man felt a wave of something indescribable. Sympathy for the elephants. But more than that, recognition of something familiar. He thanked the trainer and continued his walk. But he couldn't shake the thought. How many of us are like those mighty elephants? How many of us are still held back by beliefs we formed long ago, when we were smaller, weaker, or less certain of ourselves? That day, the man left the camp with a lesson stamped deeply into his mind. The limits we accept aren't always real. Sometimes they're nothing more than a rope tied to our past. And maybe, just maybe, it's time to pull harder and break free.